Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. My name is Mansa, and today we're going to discuss the Canadian elections, which are actually happening as we speak. And with me to talk about the elections, I've got Comrade Angie. Hi, Comrade.
Hello.
Do you want to introduce yourself and the section?
Yes. The section here in Canada and Quebec, the Trotskyist League in Quebec and Canada, is a little bit of a unique section in the ICL in that we have one nation state and two nations. So, for example, I am the editor of our English language newspaper, Workers Tribune. And then we also have our French language newspaper, République Ouvrière, because we are operating in two different nations. And our perspective is one state, one party. But for the moment, we are a binational party. And it sort of gives a little context for the political dynamics that exist in Canada and Quebec and in relation to the US, which we'll talk more about.
Maybe make it more explicit, which we won't talk about today, but the position is that we're for Quebec independence, yes?
Yes, that is our position.
Yeah.
It is a motor force for class struggle, and the struggle for national and social liberation go hand in hand in this society.
Yeah. And I think, again, I know you guys have something special in the works, which we'll talk about, I hope, in the coming weeks. But this is really, I think, key in terms of understanding the left in the country that is called Canada. But I guess to bring it to today, we've got elections going on in Canada today on the 28th of April. Could you explain what's going on, what's at stake in these elections, and what is in store for workers? Because I think the result is kind of clear cut. As far as I know, all polls are pointing to the win for Mark Carney, who's the Liberal Party guy. So maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit like what's posed in these elections and who are the kind of competing forces.
Yes, so that is pretty good context for what we're questions we're going into with these elections. As we titled our election statements, the big lie elections, prepare for coming attacks. And the reason for that is there is a lot posed for the working class right now, but the elections, which are painted by the media and the political establishment as historic and, nation defining, et cetera, actually really underscored that this election is about what the US Canada relationship is going to be like and how the ruling class parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, are angling to be the, quote, best negotiator for dealing with a Trump-led United States. So the elections are polarized around the Liberals and Tories, with most of the population sort of rallying behind the national unity as the means to fight Trump, that by allying with the Liberals or the Tories. And the reason that we say prepare for coming attacks is because this is in the context of the U.S. redefining its relationship with its allies, with the neo-colonies that it has its boot on, all in gearing up towards reshoring U.S. imperialism. And that's what is happening in the relationship with the U.S. putting the squeeze on Canada, and the ruling class here being in a difficult position in that it is very dependent on the U.S. and at the same time is posed at the moment, because of the betrayals of the labor misleaders, as the best option for, quote, defending all of Canada, the working class, etc.
Yeah. To me, growing up in Canada, which is the best friends of the US, it's really bizarre to be watching this kind of showdown, between Poilievre and Carney about who is best going to lead the fight against the US. It's just really bizarre. I guess in terms of what you said, let me step back, because before, like, these elections, they were kind of precipitated by the whole, crisis unleashed by Trump. But before this, we had 10 years, or maybe even more, we had 10 years of Trudeau. Trudeau was like the kind of image of Canada for the longest time. And there was bubbling for some time then, real resentment and hatred for what Trudeau had done to the country. And could you walk us through that? Because prior to the Trump upset, all signs pointed to that Canada was going to really put a conservative in office, and that was going to be Poilievre. And that was a bit of an upset. And I wonder if you could just explain a little bit the background picture.
Just even several months ago, from the beginning of the year, all signs pointed to a majority conservative government with Poilievre at the head. And that, as you said, that was in reaction to a lot of discontentment that came about from the real crises that were brought about by Trudeau Liberal policies over the last 10 years. You've got a cost of living crisis, housing crisis, etc. And because there was no alternative within the working class to oppose Trudeau and, what the declining standard of living that was that the working class is facing here. There are sectors of the working class and more that moved to Poilievre as the anti-Trudeau option because he was critical of Trudeau policies, etc. Mm-hmm. And the Liberals were collapsing. I mean, not collapsing as a political force, but there was no way they were going to win an election as early as even early January this year, before Trump brought out the trade attacks and the threats about Canada becoming the 51st state.
That's right.
And so what happened with that was one of the most rapid comebacks in sort of on the electoral scale in Canada, with a quick spike back of the Liberals during the leadership race as the Liberal Party was campaigning to replace Trudeau. And Carney was the front runner of this. Everyone knew he was going to come out as the next Liberal leader, rallying. But Carney in particular and the Liberals were the most successful in tapping into the quote Trump effect and the menace, the threat that Trump was raging that Canada should become part of the U.S. Mm-hmm. And he really whipped up that if to defend Canada, to defend it from becoming part of the U.S., that he was the best position to do that. And a lot of people have moved over back to the Liberals because of that, in particular from the New Democrats, the Social Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. Which was in alliance with the Liberals for the better part of the last 2 to 3 years of the last Liberal government, propping it up with an agreement to keep it in power as long as it brought about some very modest reforms, which Jagmeet Singh continues to run on as the reason you should keep the NDP from being basically eliminated from Parliament, which is kind of the path that they're on since they have the lowest support in decades. But this sort of comes back to that there's no Labour option to fight Trudeau because the so-called Labour Party in Canada is in alliance with the Liberals. So Poilievre gains a lot of support, and then this gets reversed because of Trump's menace. And now what we see is probably another Liberal government coming into the power as the Conservatives, don't seem at this moment well placed to quote be the best representative for fighting Trump for the ruling class in particular.
Right. There's a lot in what you said. I think one of the things is Carney, he's a former governor of the Bank of Canada as well as the Bank of England. So I think people saw him immediately, facing such economic uncertainty. They saw him as this competent economic guy. But also, I think something that is a stable kind of sort of option. So I assume that's a large part of what pulled him back in. You mentioned also Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and traditional kind of social democratic parties and the role of the trade union bureaucracy. I mean, from afar, it does sound to me like somewhat similar in terms of what we see happening in some Western countries, where the discontent amongst the working class is channeled to right-wing populist types because they're the only forces really standing up to the establishment, but doing so in a way that whips up all kind of hysteria, uses anti-immigrant stuff and so on like that, with Farage here, like the AfD, Le Pen, etc. But would you agree that that's kind of the dynamic that really was behind the rise of Poilievre?
Yes, it's a similar dynamic. And Poilievre gives nods. It was certainly based, let me backtrack a little bit. So Poilievre definitely ran against the quote wokeism of the Liberals. Mm-hmm. Which he attributes to everything from, driving jobs back to the U.S. because of woke environmental policies, as well as sort of just the more general framework of couching everything in defending all of the Liberal government's policies under the guise of progressiveness. Mm-hmm. While these policies were driving people into the ground while saying, don't be racist. And so, but to oppose Liberal policies meant that you would somehow be painted as racist. For example, mass immigration in the context where you don't actually have enough, infrastructure for housing, healthcare, etc., has polarized society. But many people actually recognize that these were bad policies, but under the guise of progressiveness, to oppose it, would come out as racist. And then the trade union leaderships and social democrats don't actually challenge the economic problems brought about by the liberal policies because they implicitly support them, but push anti-racist training. And this really polarizes society on a basis where you get a move towards right-wing ideology and right-wing populism, which Poilievre does push. It's still in a more nuanced context because it's Canada and all political parties rely on votes coming from immigrant-derived populations. So Poilievre isn't explicitly anti-immigrant as you would have happening in the U.S.
Yeah, actually, I noticed that in Surrey or Vancouver, it was the major Sikh festival, Vaisakhi. He was at the podium with the other Sikh leaders, and that's a huge. I think that's the largest Sikh diaspora event outside of India. So I can understand that there would be a nuance to how Poilievre can't just openly pull that. Yeah.
But it does polarize on a similar kind of basis. And it certainly has divided the working class because the working class is not united against Team Canada in these elections, the Tories and Conservatives, but are united with one party or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of Team Canada, you started off by kind of giving our listeners a context of our section and what Canada is, right? It's two nations, one state. Now, I'm just wondering, with respect to Team Canada, what role have the parties from Quebec played in the context of this whole national unity? Could you give some context to how this question and the whole kind of, Trump wanting to annex the country and so on, how has that played out with Quebec, and how does that really impact the national level politics?
Yes, it has had an impact. With Trump's threats against Canada and Quebec, there has been a pulling together of, we all have to defend Canada, and that includes, pulling support from the Bloc Québécois in the federal elections. Mm-hmm. So in the similar context of how the Conservatives were basically poised for taking power early this year before the Trump's attacks, the Bloc was looking like it was going to perhaps even gain as much support as to be the official opposition, which is something that the bourgeois nationalist leadership in Quebec with the Bloc and the Parti Québécois were looking towards as the electoral path towards national liberation. Mm-hmm. But they, even in the context of saying that Canada is not going to defend the interest of Quebec, the Bloc, the Parti Québécois, they both make correct criticisms. And the leader of the Bloc Blanchet is correct when he says that Quebec's interests are going to get thrown under the bus when Canada is negotiating economic deals, etc. But the solution is that you have to choose Quebec, vote for the Bloc as the means to defend Quebec's interest, because you can't rely on the government in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. But the whole framework is to ally with that same government that you can't rely on. So their framework has nothing to do with breaking from Canadian or U.S. imperialism, because on the other side of it is that they push dangerous illusions that Quebec prosperity is going to come by having a stabilizing the relationship with the U.S. imperialists under Trump, and that what they specifically push is a renegotiation of the North America trade agreement as the means to do that. And this is all reflection of a bankrupt strategy of keeping the struggle against the U.S., against Trump, as well as fighting against national oppression of Quebec within the framework of relying on the imperialist, the Canadian U.S. imperialist, which means that neither of the struggles for national emancipation or for even standing up to Trump are really going to benefit the working class.
Mm-hmm. And so does the Bloc have support amongst Quebecois workers?
Yes. So, for example, there's the Trois-Rivières, which is kind of a small industrial city in between Montreal and Quebec, is a Bloc stronghold.
Okay.
For example, and then there are other parts of Quebec as well. But for the first time in I don't know how many elections or decades, it's looking like Trois-Rivières might go with the Liberals, which gives a reflection too of the national unity pressure. The best thing to do is to ally with Canada right now against the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so the Bloc has been finding itself in political trouble, which is why it's shifted its current campaigning in the days before the election, which is to block a majority government from coming into power. Vote block to make sure that there's not a majority government in Ottawa at the end of the elections.
That's pretty sad.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess a previous statement that you guys had written in Workers Tribune with the title, Canadian Capitalism Will Cave, Only Workers Can Stand Up to Trump. And the reason why I want to talk about that is to actually tease out some of the changes that Canada can see and predict with Trump coming in. Because I think one of the key arguments we're making is that, well, as the headline says, only workers can stand up to Trump. Like Carney's not going to be able to do it. Canadian capitalist class is going to cave to Trump, no matter how kind of, tough they're talking right now. So could you maybe lay out a little bit the dynamics of what we can expect in terms of the coming period?
So, yes. So what can we expect with the Carney-Trump relationship, which is most likely to come out of this election? I think for me to respond, I do want to take a little bit of a step back to talk about the U.S.-Canada relationship, which is useful to have the context for why Canadian capitalism will cave and the specifics of this society. So Canada, everybody knows Canada is tied very closely to the U.S. And this came out of World War II, when Canada basically moving over into a closer alliance with the U.S., which came out of that period as like the hegemonic power. And ever since that time, the economic and political ties between the two countries have only been further integrated, and not so much out of like this policy or that policy, but largely out of just the gravitational pull of Canada being a much smaller economy connected by landmass to the U.S. hegemon. And Canada's role in the world has always been during the epoch of liberalism and globalization was to be the progressive democratic values face of imperialism. And so now that world order is breaking down as Trump is trying to shore up U.S. imperialism. And so the dynamics of the U.S.-Canada relationship have to change as well. And that's where there's political crisis in Canada. And as I said before, the two countries are very, very integrated. I mean, Canada, for example, depends on 80% of its exports with trade with the U.S. Mm-hmm. Even if you double the international trade, which all the parties talk about increasing international trade to reduce dependency on the U.S., even if you double that, it's still going to mean that the U.S. is a huge part. And I don't even think it's possible to double that in any short period of time. So economically, Canada is tied to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so the capitalists don't have much maneuver room. And so whatever resistance they're putting up now is really more to do with, getting who they think the best representative is to do the negotiations with Trump for renegotiating the, quote, security and economic agreements between the two countries. And the U.S. is going to demand concessions because it's compelled to and shoring up U.S. imperialism by squeezing Canada. Mm-hmm. Among others. And so they will cave because it's in their interest to do the ruling class of Canada's interest to do so. But somebody's going to have to pay for it. So it's going to be the working class. And that's why the working class has to be preparing to defend itself, and also why it can't rely on the ruling class or its parties, the Liberals or the Tories, because they will defend the interests of the ruling class. So they can't be a reliable ally. And so it is really dangerous for the working class to be tied to them when they should be unifying with other layers of the working class, including in the U.S., against Trump.
Okay, I guess to give our listeners a bit of a sense of what the working class is facing, maybe we can talk about, you've spoken about how integrated the Canadian economy is with the US. And I think that for me, one of the things that stands out immediately is the auto sector, that's the case with Mexico as well. But, the whole upending that Trump is doing with its allies and so on, that's going to have drastic implications for workers, right? So could you give us a little bit of a sense of what's in store for the working class and why it's actually so urgent to break with this Team Canada national unity for the working class?
Yes, the auto sector is a good one to speak about because it is already facing impacts from the trade war. There have been layoffs
already.
Yes, there have been some, or at least temporary layoffs. It's sort of all these things are unclear, temporary layoffs. So, for example, there was a rally on Saturday organized by the Unifor leadership for protecting Canadian jobs organized in Windsor, Ontario. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of useful to look at that that demonstration for what's at stake for the working class and what its leadership is doing at the moment. So, like I said, this rally was protect Canadian jobs, and our comrades from Toronto, went with our leaflet on the big lie elections and the why Canadian capitalism will cave. And what was sort of like a notable anecdote that my comrade told me about was talking to workers. Like literally, you can look across the Ambassador Bridge, and Detroit is right there. Like you can see Detroit.
Yeah.
But the idea of having mobilized workers, even for that rally from Detroit, had crossed no one's mind. It certainly wasn't the framework of the trade union leadership, who has been channeling all of this into into alliance with the what is currently the Liberal government. The Unifor has, Lana Payne, the president of Unifor at the rally, was making the point that she's been in the halls of Parliament, she's been at the tables with businesses, and that's the way to defend Canadian jobs. Like they've literally been trying to make the working class a partner with the bosses, while at the same time saying that the businesses are going to do what they need to defend their profits. But that's the whole framework of Unifor, which is that you get a progressive government in office. Like they do support the Liberals, not officially, but their policies, if you look at their Unifor's proposals for how to deal with Trump and economic proposals, they are very much in line with the Liberal Party in what they're putting forward, and very much a part of defending the national unity framework. So, for example, when it comes to military spending, which all parties were going to be pushing up because the U.S. is dictating that its allies start to pay more for policing imperialism in the world. And so Unifor says, yeah, we're for increasing military spending, but as long as it's for defending Canadian sovereignty and as long as it's for bringing jobs to Canada. So, like, they're using the national unity to actually defend the military spending that's going to be increased, and tying it to the ruling class response to the crisis that Trump has brought. And so, this is what Lana Payne was speaking about at this rally. Like, you have to fight the right, you have to fight Trump, and you have to do that with what Unifor has been doing by presenting itself as an equal partner at the table with the bosses and the government. But what's posed for the working class is that, well, the ruling class is going to cave to Trump. You can't defend jobs with trade wars, which is also what they're putting forward with retaliatory tariffs against Trump's tariffs, which has already meant layoffs and more to come. And also that this gets in the way, what the Unifor leadership is putting forward, it gets in the way of mobilizing with other workers. Like I said, in Detroit would be a very natural place to start for auto. But the idea that Canadian and U.S. auto workers have more in common with each other is not the framework of the trade union leadership. But that is absolutely what's necessary today to fight for both American and Canadian and Quebecois workers, is to unify with each other. But that means breaking alliance with the ruling classes of the respective nations, because auto in the U.S., the leadership there of the UAW, supports Trump's tariffs. And so this nationalism is so critical to what is holding the working class back in the moment, when it has to be preparing for the attacks that are on the horizon.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, you started this episode by talking about how there's really no working class alternative. And I think that was the picture you just gave of Unifor, which is one of the major unions in the country, like that is some wretched perspective. And, obviously, yeah, it's Detroit, it's auto. Why wouldn't you mobilize across the border? But I think it's entirely a question of their strategy. I want to start talking a little bit about, okay, so we've established a little bit of the canvas here, right? Like the working class is about to be pummeled. And, like the Canadian capitalists, okay, fine, Carney might strike a, very competent pose, but ultimately, at the end of the day, he's there to represent the interests of Canadian capitalism, and that is totally tied to the US, and as a result, they're going to cave. And, there's really no kind of working class alternative. There's no voices that are really putting forward a working class perspective. And that was the case in these elections, right? I mean, we said in our statement that these are big lie elections, and there's no choice for workers. We called workers to not vote.
We said, don't waste your vote on these parties that are going to betray.
Yeah.
and start preparing for fighting
Yeah.
the national unity and
Exactly.
mobilizing for how the working class can defend itself.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, that's really what's posed now. What should the working class start to do, like concretely? Because we are obviously warning, attacks are coming, you must prepare. So could you lay out a little bit to any workers who are listening, what does preparation look like for the coming period?
Like I said, like what's necessary is for the working class to unite
Right.
against Trump, obviously, and
Hmm.
against Team Canada, which
Right.
is the main obstacle to unifying the working class across the border and U.S. between U.S. and Canada, as well as what gets in the way of unifying the workers across Canada between Canada and Quebec in the different industries. You're gonna get different industries pitted against each other in this context, and so it's important to unify because that's where the strength lies for the working class to fight for itself. But that means a fight against its current leaderships. And so, what that means to prepare for their attacks and for the attacks on public services that are sure to come from the liberals, but or the Tories. But how do you fight to defend, to defend yourself in that? It's by mobilizing class against class. And so concretely, like I said, there's the example of the Detroit Windsor connection.
Right.
So the labor movement workers should be mobilizing to send delegations to industry, to workers in the US and similar and other industries. And as well between Canada and Quebec, having like a working class alliance to put forward what is needed, for broadly for the working class and from industry to industry, so that's like, it's a concrete thing, but it's so outside the perspective of the trade union leaderships. And on some levels, it's as simple as mobilizing common strikes or common struggles. So what's going to happen when the Windsor auto workers continue to face more layoffs? Well, they're talking about doing occupations, but the Canadian auto sector is the small fragment of that of North America. And so that will only go so far unless you have allies in the working class in the US.
Yeah.
And so, sending delegations between the two industries, between the two countries is a good starting point. But then it should also include other sectors like Quebec aluminum, for example, where there's also layoffs that are expected to be happening and as an important part of the Quebec economy. These are not unrelated industries either, but just sort of on a basic level of like organizing on that level, like these workers are our allies and we should be coming up with a joint response. And this means challenging US and Canadian imperialism. It means defending the national rights of Quebec. It means defending Mexico from imperialist subjugation, which is under the boot of the US. It means opposing the attacks on China, because that is the main target of U.S. imperialism, of which the Canadian ruling class and the Liberal government are always in lockstep with the U.S. on. So those are like some basic things that the working class can do to oppose its own ruling class as part of the struggle to defend itself. And obviously, like I should have said this first and foremost, is that it's to oppose the counter tariffs, because the counter tariffs are pushed as the main weapon to fight Trump, and it is what ties the working class to the Canadian ruling class. All the main trade union federations defend them in some way or another. That's sort of the key, like the tie that binds. And so that's a starting point. And also, you can't fight the counter tariffs, you can't fight the protectionism with free trade either, which is what the trade union leaderships are pushing when they say we need a fast renegotiation of the trade agreement, the North America Trade Agreement, the USMCA, as the means to defending Canadian jobs. So it's like pushing free trade against protectionism, but like I said, there has to be a working class alliance against imperialism.
I think you really just concretely explained quite well what it means to actually to try and build working class unity and fight for working class anti-imperialist alliance in opposition to kind of this whole like barrage of nationalism that is pushed. You've explained Canada. Last week I was talking with Comrade Victor, and the same thing is playing out in Mexico with Scheinbaum. Obviously Trump, lots of workers support him, but I think like in each of these cases it's really like how nationalism is really used to bind the working class to the ruling class, and how this is really key. Also, I think the way you were explaining, the role of Unifor and the trade union bureaucracy, and in terms of like totally undermining the struggle for building like unity across borders. I think I'm just looking at the statement here. What we say as one of our demands is the union and NDP tops are complete bootlickers of the Liberals. And what's needed is really to forge a class struggle leadership of the unions and a real workers' party. So I feel like what you've just laid out is kind of the tenets of how to fight for a class like a struggle leadership in the unions. What should workers who are in the labor movement, what should they be fighting for? They should really be going out and fighting against like the national unity with the bosses. They should be fighting against arms shipments, against like funding the military, against all this kind of tariff counter tariff drama, and really championing like the need to build unity with their American, Mexican, Quebecois workers. So I appreciate the way you kind of laid that out really concretely. I think that covers the questions I had about the elections. Is there anything else?
Just to sort of reiterate the point that the working class isn't going to be able to hold its ground or even take a step forward if they remain tied to the Canadian capitalists. Mm-hmm. Because they are going to capitulate to Trump. They are not a reliable ally. They are the class enemy because their interests are tied to the US. And so the only way to go forward is by forging a fighting alliance of Canadian, Quebecois, American, and Mexican workers. I mean, and beyond, but in the North American context where these questions are so directly interrelated between Mexico, Canada, Quebec, and the US. It is one fight against Trump and against the ruling classes of Canada and Mexico and the labor misleaders that are all standing in the way of the struggle that needs to happen. And there needs to be a break with the national unity for any of this to go forward. That means fighting Team Canada in the election today and in the days after, because the national unity will continue for a period until, discontent grows because there's going to be attacks. And the question is going to be, where is it going to go? And we need a fighting labor movement to lead it in the right direction and a new leadership of the working class.
I think that was great the way you just put that. I think that's a great way to wrap up. Before we do wrap up, we do want to just quickly push our social media because Workers Tribune is on X and Instagram. Is that right, Angie?
That is correct. So on X, the handle is workers_tribune. And on Instagram, it's Workers Tribune, just one word.
Okay, excellent. So if you like this episode, do give our comrades a follow. And that's it for me today. Thank you very much, Angie, for joining us to explain what's happening in the elections.
And thank you very much for having me.